Or should I send them to you via email?
No, not yet, Dr. Kerchy.
Okay, may we start the conference now? Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon for Associate Professor Dr. Habil Kerchy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second International Conference on Social, Political and Humanities, or ICoSoP 2021, organized by Faculty of Social and Political Science, Universitas Bangka Belitung, and Akademisi. We will have a presentation delivered by our honorable keynote speakers, Associate Professor Dr. Habil Kerchy from University of Szeged, Hungary. This section will be led by our senior moderator, Mr. Andi Fernanda, MA. After that, we will have a parallel session for all the oral speaker participants. Today, the parallel session is about sociology and culture. Now the time is for the keynote speaker. So I am now pleased to invite Mr. Andre Fernanda, MA, to lead the keynote speaker presentation. Mr. Andre, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Kia, right? Okay, do you hear my voice clearly?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good day and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in the second International Conference of Social, Political and Humanities 2021. Today we are presenting the fourth keynote talk, and our initial topic is current trends in the study of children and young adult literature. This is, the most popular topic right now because I think it got less tertarik of some scholars. Yeah. And ladies and gentlemen, first let me introduce myself. My name is Andre Fernanda. I am a lecturer at English Literature Department, Universitas Bangka Belitung. I graduated from Universitas Gadjah Mada, but my thesis has been done in Monash University, Australia. And I am also a content creator of MMag Kids Fun House that I just got silver play button last month, and it was a great feeling. And I am also a founder of mediatikusastra.com. Okay, I will be the moderator of this keynote talk session. I am very happy to see you and welcome all of you to this lecture. Okay, I want to introduce about the keynote speaker today. We have Associate Professor Dr. Habil Kerchy from University of Szeged, Hungary. Okay, Dr. Kerchy is an associate professor at English Department of the University of Szeged, Hungary. She holds a PhD in literature from the University of Szeged and DAR in semiology from University Paris. Then Denis Diderot. Sorry for misspelling of my French language. And as well as a habilitation degree in literature and culture from University of Debrecen. Her research interests include intermedial cultural representations, the post-semiotic of the embodied subject, interfacings of Victorian and post-modern fantastic imagination, gender studies. Oh, that's really good. Women's art, fairy tales, and children or young adult literature. And beside numerous revered essays published in international journals and collection, she has authored 3 monographs. The first one is Alice in Transmedia Wonderland, Curiouser and Curiouser New World of Children's Classic, and it won the Senior Book Award of the Hungarian Society of English Studies. And the second one, body text in the novel of Angela Cotta, written from corporeographic. And the last one is essay in feminist aesthetic and narratology. And she also co-edited 7 essay collection of the fairy tale vanguard, postmodern reinterpretation of fairy tales, the literary fantastic, the iconology of law and order, the cultural history of continental European freak shows, and the post-humanism in fantastic fiction, as well as an EJES special journal issue on feminist intervention into intermediate studies, a book bird special journal issues on translating and transmediating children's literature and cultures, and an Americana special issues on interspecies encounter in post-millennial filmic fantasies. And her most recent volume is Translating and Transmediating Children's Literature, co-edited with John Sunmark, published with Pelgaf Macmillan 2021. And if you have any question further, you can email her at kerchy@gmail.com. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I will divide this keynote talk into 3 sessions. The first one is a presentation from our keynote speaker, Dr. Anna Kerchy, and the second one will be question and answer session, and the last one is a conclusion. Okay, without any further delay, allow me to welcome Dr. Anna Kerchy. The time and screen are yours.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. It's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to sharing my ideas with you. So here I will try to share my screen because I have PowerPoint slides that I would like to work with. Okay, I'm not sure if you are, can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay,
We can see your screen.
I will try to go to my first slide. Okay. Okay, I wonder like why it's not. Okay, I will try that. Sorry about that. I will try that again because I would like to move on from the first slide. And for some reason I couldn't go back to the earlier one. Okay, let me see. Okay. I'm not sure why I cannot move between the slides. Because this has never happened to me before. Okay, for some reason, to be on the safe side, I sent you this slideshow earlier on today. Oops. So I wonder if you can perhaps open that, or I will try to.
Yes, I already get your email, and I will try to send it to the host.
Okay, for some reason it's not really working for me. Yeah, I'll keep trying, but I cannot move between the slides. Okay. So maybe if the host can help me out, that would be wonderful. For me, it
I
seems
will probably,
Mr. Prof,
excuse me,
could you
Dr.
help
Kerchy.
us?
I will send your PowerPoint to the host.
okay. So I will just start talking perhaps, and then
Yep.
we can, when we get the slides, I would be grateful if someone could help me out with them, and I will just let you know, like when we need to move to the next slide. Okay, apologies for this inconvenience. My topic for today is current trends of children's and young adult literature, and I would like to focus on analytical approaches to fairy tale cultures and media. So basically, I will suggest to read children's literature as wonder tales and seek a kinship between the two genres and somehow map the theoretical approaches this comparative reading will invite. So I would like to start out from the assumption that the most remarkable feature of fairy tales is their effective narratological potential. That is to stimulate wonder, to somehow activate the unconscious, intuitive, imaginative aspects of the mind. So the fairy tales, like children's literature, will engage audiences in a fantastic vision of a fictional alternate universe that enchants by suspending the natural physical laws and the rational logic of understanding of ordinary reality. But they can also help us to provide, they will provide somehow an understanding of the perplexing complexity of human existence, as well as a diversity of the thought systems. These tales will help us find a way in the maze of everyday life by urging us to learn to be amazed at its fundamental unpredictability. So according to Maria Tatar, while reading fairy tales, imaginativeness can be put in the surface of crafting a relational model of identity while sharing communal practices of crisis management. Less a refuge from life than a quiet sanctuary, tales offer us a chance to meet characters worth observing and to witness how they manage conflict, peril, and adventure. Jack Zipes and Marina Warner highlight the ideology critical, ethical significance of the educative function of the genre grounded in fantasizing agency. So they will define the wonder tale as a narrative compounded of dread and desire, fascination, and inquiry. This challenges prevailing regimes of power and meaning and can compensate for the lack of power, wealth, and pleasure that most people experience. These stories evoke profound feelings of awe and a respect for life's miraculous processes, alterable with the help of a little imagination, driven by a hope for change. And this hope for change will be something that is significant for us here. Okay. For some reason, then my slides came into picture. Okay. So I wonder, have you managed to solve the problem of the slides, or there is no solution yet to come?
It's still working.
Okay, okay, wonderful. Okay, so can we please move to the first slide? Okay, the one up. Thank you very much. Okay, and I will let you know that we need to move on. Thank you, I appreciate this help. So fairy tales somehow combine an inquisitiveness about reality and a fascination with its fantastic revision. So you have a wide spectrum of desires, dreads, and you have somehow a combination with between active experience and passive enrapturement, between visual thinking and a socio-political critical potential. So basically, you have all those points highlighted on the slides: the effective narratological aspects, the wonder, amazement, and then the politics of poetics. That this is a kind of an escapist genre, very much about make-believing, both children's literature and fairy tale fantasies, but there is also a social critical potential somehow hidden in them. Can we please move to the next slide, please? And I will continue my talk. So next slide. Bolstering the imagination by an apparently escapist wishful thinking for the sake of getting to know more about the impending potentialities of an actual surrounding world, ourselves and others, fulfills a didactic agenda. This is somehow foregrounded throughout the canonical sedimentation of fairy tales as a genre primarily targeting child audiences. Wondrous stories about the wisdom of the ignorant, the unsuspected, shape-shifting, metamorphic powers of the overlooked, the marvel of the mundane, hold a particular appeal for the marginalized minorities. This can be minors, children living in the shadow of grown-ups. Most children's stories, like fairy tales, embark on non-mimetically remapping, quirky, critical, alternative versions of reality. They respond to the ultimate question of childhood. Why? Why are things as they are? Why they cannot be different? So just like fairy tales about quests, transformations, or magic can expand the experiences gained from lived reality and facilitate the integration of both vulnerability and empowerment within the self, children's and young adult literature allows young readers to negotiate a passage from the real to the symbolic, from childhood to adulthood, from the imaginary to the real. They are somehow textual compasses, if you like, to create a coherent self in periods of identity crisis during childhood and adolescence. So both the West fairy tales and children's fiction teach readers to think for themselves, to consider others' viewpoints with a generous combination of curiosity and empathy. They somehow also create a meta-narrative commentary about the functioning of imagination itself that seeks to change the world, struggling to comply with it or to transgress its frames. They are permeated by wonder to make new enchanting stories that make interest beyond the colonizing narratives of tonality. Yan Wu, Kerry Malan, and Roderick Gillises call the major feat of children's literature an education by fantasy that urges an imaginative construction of possible words to open up to political vistas by exploring innovative models of remapping our lived realities. The lines along which this remapping should take place are an empathic consideration of others' perspective and then the desire to discover how memory shapes our understanding our past and then what future holds for us. This is what they call an imaginative responsibility for confronting the world as we know it, or as it might be, or even as it might have been. This allows to consider multiple ways of knowing, curiosity, creativity, pleasure, and imagination as bedrock of reason in its most exalted form. So it's kind of interesting that they don't take imagination and reason as binaries, but somehow as interconnected. Can we please move to the next slide? Thank you. So this chapter, chapter of our talk will interface fairy tale cultures and children's young adult literature as magic mirrors of imagination. This is Susan Reddington Bobby's concept, with the aim to analyze the changing meanings attributed to fantasy. How is fantasy interpreted in both in theoretical and then in artistic narratives? Fantasy can be regarded as an innocent, infantile psychic automatism, or as a compensatory, creative self-consolation of traumatized grown-ups, or as a sort of solitary survival strategy, or an exercise in solidarity with others, or an ideology-contained commodity, a bestseller, if you like, or another option, a self-deconstructing engine of liberation from social constraints. So these are all different understandings of fantasy and imagination, which are kernel engines of children's literature. Can we move to the next slide, please? Examining the changing place of children's literature within today's shifting media ecologies permits us to critically reflect on the marketing strategy of family entertainment pieces with somehow commercialized imagination for a homogenized mass of consumers, and to welcome provocatively subversive artistic gambits which refuse to participate in the ideological colonization of children's imagination, which somehow create revisions against the mainstream. The modes of enchantment elicited by intermedial shifts or metafictional additions prove to be representative of communal cultural anxieties, dreams, and desires of our given specific socio-historical era's fantasies. So there are new ways of relating to fictional realities which tie in with reinterpretations of the very notion of children's fiction, of childhood, of childlikeness. The child as a fragile fetus is reinterpreted, epitomized in our cultural imaginary by a relentless curiosity and the penchant for wonder. So this is a kind of a new understanding of childhood itself, along with the reinterpretation of the purposes of children's literature. Can we move to the next slide, please? Whenever it comes to celebrating the uses of enchantment, of course, we are familiar with this concept from Bruno Bettelheim's psychoanalytical analysis of fairy tales. So when we celebrate the uses of enchantment earned from the psychologically beneficial, therapeutical, educative aspects of children's stories and fairy tales, seen as the most reliable cultural instruments for children's socialization, then we have a question emerging. Whose enchantment is really at stake? Research on interconnections of reception aesthetics and canon formation convincingly argued that the decision makers have always been grown-ups, adults who keep exercising an impact on the choice of books children will eventually read. Adults will influence the representation of children's images in children's books, and then they will also influence the theoretical evaluation of the genre. So they are sort of ventriloquist agents, voices, opinions in place of the children to represent them as the other of adult. The child is either seen as an idealized cultural construct delimiting a specific narrative register suitable for children, or the child is seen as a daydreaming, disobedient, disruptive force, even a monster child who symbolically incarnates creativity, a possibility of change, risk, and setting adrift mature manhood. This is Kimberly Reynolds talking about that. So with the notions of childhood, the purposes and practice of children's literature change over time. Along with the changing cultural evaluation of fairy tales are no longer seen as static literary models to be internalized for therapeutical consumptions, and neither do our children's literary pieces. They are more seen like fluid forms shaped by social interactions, and they are possible instruments of individual autonomy. There's C.S. Lewis, who refused to treat children as a strange species whose habits you have made up like an anthropologist or a commercial traveler. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, and Maurice Sendak, the author of many famous children's books, among them Where the Wild Things Are, rejected the label writing for children. E.B. White proclaimed famously that the writers of children's books have to write up and not down. So then numerous critics pointed out an extension of the age of children's fiction. While in 19th century, in the Victorian era of Alice in Wonderland, Alice is barely 7 years old. In the 1930s, 12 is the ideal age of a child in children's literature. And then by the 1950s and into the 80s, 14 years olds regularly appear. And from the 1980s, you have a new category, young adult fiction. First through appropriating the work of adult writers, later as new teen lists, until the emergence, the real label of young adult fiction. These will necessarily feature older child protagonists in their late teens. The label crossover fiction by Sandra Beckett is also a useful term of contemporary children's literature. In cinematic adaptations, the category family adventures could be compatible with that. basically denotes the blurring of the boundary lines between child, a young adult, and even adult interpretive communities. And you have this archaic feature of folk and fairy tales evoked here, that it's not necessarily meant for children and only children, but it's more like really a family entertainment. Creative imagination becomes the ground of intergenerational bonding between different generations. Since truly fine tales address all, enabling a sort of time travel, whereby even mature, older readers can nostalgically travel back to their forgotten childhoods when they rebelled against maturity's conventions, and children can daringly activate futuristic or anachronistic scenarios at their own whim. So it's really a sort of a time travel through this intergenerational bonding. The age-old interest in fairyland relates to a curiosity about the world, a flexibility of response, and an ability to play. And this is another major feature of contemporary understandings and theoretical approaches to children's literature, the celebration of this ludic quality. So you have ludology as a new trend, the study of play as a new trend, reading as play, fantasizing as play, working and playing with books as play. Terry Pratchett associates with neoteny this ability to play, a juvenilization, a retaining of use humans developed into a survival strategy. What he says is, as a species, we are forever sticking our fingers into the electric socket of universe to see what will happen next. So basically, Pratchett is suggesting that curiosity is not only an infantile feature, but it's a human species characteristic. Can we move to the next slide, please? The idealization of infantile imaginativeness as a basis of moral philosophical program organizing the deep structural foundation of the fairy tale provides a starting point for numerous theoretical definitions of the genre. Chesterton writes in 1908 an essay called The Ethics of Elfland, and he celebrates an interpretive attitude, a mode of being, a universal open-mindedness characteristic of children uncorrupted by social prejudices and anxieties in this essay. And this is what he calls the ethics of Elfland, something that a morality that we can learn from fairy tale, a morality of open-mindedness. Like Pratchett, who argues that fairy tales and fantasies help readers to preserve a curiosity about the world, a flexibility of response, and an ability to play, which they normally lose as they grow up, Chesterton too finds the fairy logic concomitant with children's social sensibility and resilience, applicable to our wild and startling yet delightful world, which might have been quite different, but is rich with these unfulfilled possibilities lurking beneath the actualized realities. So there is even this kind of a quantum physical aspect of possible realities being celebrated here. It invites all to relate compassionately, solidariously towards any forms of non-normative otherness, alterities as potential sources of unpredictable magic. So there is this democratic, egalitarian, empathic, solidarious aspects, really the politics of poetics, as I suggested on the first slide, that is implied in Chesterton's Ethics of Elfland. Fairy tales children mature moral standards by allowing the good to triumph, yet there is an epistemology of uncertainty, of hesitation, that is familiar to children because of their relatively limited knowledge of the world. This is what guarantees the charm of the stories, in which unpredictable chance, called miracle, providence, magic, is something that is a predictable plot organizing device. It will be there in children's stories and fairy tales. Therefore, the wisdom learned might eventually be the recognition of our ignorance, the knowledge of the world's unknowability, that becomes a liberating experience reframed in terms of the ethics of wonder. This is feminist philosopher Marguerite Lacaze, who defined as a generous respect and a non-possessive desire for what we cannot fully understand. C.S. Lewis also argued for the uses of fantastic imagination in our quest for meaning, fueled by what he called a longing for the I know not what. This is again something that is effectively charged, a cognitive dissonance. He identified, he's somehow inspired by Tolkien's thoughts, and fairy stories. He identifies it as a major prerequisite for writing for children. So all children's literature should have this quality. In Lewis's view, unlike realistic fiction, likely to leave daily frustrations unresolved, unproblematized in young readers' psyches, books inviting to fairylands, an umbrella term he used is to denote all children's literature, arouse a yearning for the unknowable. Far from dulling or emptying the actual word, they give it a new dimension of depth. So what he says is, one does not despise real woods because he has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little bit enchanted. And the child reading the fairy tales desires and is happy in the very act of desiring. So besides an argument against charges of regressive escapism in favor of the genre's psychologically therapeutical potential, this is basically a reinterpretation of the Freudian psychoanalytical understanding of desire as something that is traumatic, something that is connected to loss. This is here something that is enriching this desire for the unknowable. So fantasizing based on a surplus of proliferating meaning incites desire for enchantment, and an enchantment by a desire that leads through word magic to an unspeakable sense of completeness. Again, grounded in this curiosity, uncertitude, vulnerability, and a hope against all odds as integral parts of a marvelous totality of being. This is something that we can connect to Todorov's, another major scholar of the literary fantastic. He talks about the desire rooted in hesitation as a productive force of enchantment, something that is connected to incertitude. And this is something that goes against this globalized consumer pleasure dictated by capitalist regimes, because it's much more creative and it's much more enriching. Can we move to the next slide, please? So lessons on imaginativeness and an engine of resilience and a playful mockery of normative thinking and disciplinary ideology prove to offer a more fertile ground for crossover creative repurposings of fairy tales. Neil Gaiman has a motto in his children's Gothic fantasy Coraline that is paradigmatic of how postmodern fiction recycles the fairy tale tradition for the sake of children's empowerment. He says, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. So accordingly, we have a character called Coraline, who is this tomboyish little girl assisted by a talking cat who defeats a monster figure, a witch figure, the other mother, an uncanny double of her real mother who wants to replace her eyes with buttons and steal her soul. And this is by accomplishing a quest for herself through bravely facing the otherness lurking within herself and denouncing her infantile desire for dependence as unreliable. She enacts a cleverly subversive gender bender role, because the way she defeats the witch is that she pretends to play tea party with her dolls as she's setting a final trap for the witch. So she's pretending to be a conventional little girl, but then eventually this is a means, a method for triumphing over the witch. So basically, this is something that is an interesting, like, gender studies, gender bender aspect of the text. So basically, she authors a girl's adventure story herself. Gaiman's novel addresses over 8 years old, but it has a meta-imaginative, meta-narrative quality. You have something called psycho-narration, and this is used in cognitive narratology, another major approach to our children's literature. This will allow the readers to have a glimpse of the narrator, of the main character, focalizer's transparent mind, as Maria Nikolaeva says. So this is another way to celebrate children's fantasizing agency. You can also call this text an interesting hybrid genre of fun, canny, gothic adventure, a combination of fun, entertainment, and the uncanny, the frightening uncertainty. They are both initiated and resolved. So there is a problem occurring, and then she's eventually solving it. And this is her daydreaming pretence play that fights the villain in the game of hide and seek. And there is a haunted house, the haunted other house, a haunted replica of her own house that will disintegrate, disappear, flattened in a child-drawn sketch. So basically, curiosity is turned into a girly strategy of survival, which is interesting because mythologically speaking, curiosity is usually associated with women's sin. So it's something that is evil, that's something that is a flaw. So here it's a survival strategy that is empowering for the child character. An empowering awareness of the fantasizing awareness is something that characterizes her. Can we move to the next slide, please? I would like to say a few words about the novel's adaptations, which expand further the range of target audience, and that is the transmedia storytelling experience that we should mention because it's very, very typical of 21st century children's literature and young adult literature. In transmedia storytelling, you have integral elements of a fictional word dispersed, disseminated, spread across multiple delivery channels and media platforms, and each medium somehow makes a unique contribution to the unfolding of the story word. This is Henry Jenkins who talks about that. So there are basically different modes of enchantment workings on different media channels. And this is very, very typical of how post-millennial generations will relate to these fantasy words. And this is also telling about contemporary cultural anxieties, how we think of things which are impossibly possible. So what are the different adaptations of Neil Gaiman's novel published in 2002? We have a graphic novel adaptation that has a teenager borderline figures, so it's definitely the young adult audiences which are brought into the target readership. Then you have an animated film adaptation, which is interesting. It's sort of a family entertainment, but it has also this spooky gothic quality because it discusses adult fears about children's safety. You have Hollywood horror film tropes like the full moon, zoophobia, mad woman, child abduction, so all these strange things, but they are combined with the iconography of anti-child abuse campaigns. Even the child is represented as this defenseless ragdoll, and you also have a visual frenzy of the 3D CGI technology, because you have here, through technology, a photorealistic replica of what has never been. Something that is impossible is actually visible on the cinema screen. You have in the film a stunningly colorful alternate reality reminiscent of the fantastic theme park in the novel. And then Coraline's trademark personality marker is a blue hair. That's again something that is added by the film adaptation. So this is how she will be recognized in fan art, in cosplay. So this more like interactive approaches and recirculation of the original fantasy world, which is the characteristic of transmedia storytelling, that it's something that not only takes place on multiple media platforms, but it's something that is very, very interactive. So you have the film, you have graphic novel, you have puppet play, you have toys, games. The toys are promoted for very small children, even for toddlers and collectors too. And then you have the cosplay, where they put on costumes and impersonate the characters of the fictional universe. That's mostly young adults and teenagers too. So these spin-off products marketed online are characteristic of the 21st century production and reception of fairy tales, conditioned by pressures of globalization and hyper-consumerization, complicit in the gradual disenchantment process. But also they promise an augmentation of magic via transmediation, enhancing our intimacy with the spirit of the fictional universe due to all these gadgets, applications, and relics which facilitate an identification with the heroine. And they even train the very youngest to learn the need to deal with plurality, to learn the basic conventions of how story words work, how fantasy works. So it's not entirely just about commodification, but it's a training of these fantasists. Can we move to the next slides, please? So interactive agency and intergenerational bonding can be most efficiently activated through the meta-imaginative celebration of fantasy. So in children's literature encourages readers to take part as co-authors in the formation of their stories. They bring joy to life in order to shorten the suffering of Andersen's Little Mermaid. So these are all texts which invite readers to somehow contribute to the making of the story world. So if you think about that, in Andersen's Little Mermaid, you have this wish from the reader to behave well in order to lessen the sufferings of the mermaid, but you have something similar in Peter Pan, where in the theater stage adaptation, at the end of it, the younger the young audiences are invited to clap their hands in order to express their belief in fairies and basically help fairies survive. And you have something similar in the Never-Ending Story, where basically it's a fantasy of the young child protagonist that helps them save the kingdom of Fantastica. I'm not sure what happened because the slides disappeared. I don't know if we can go back to sharing them, and we can also move to the next slide. A major trope of putting fantasy to collaborative creative purposes in young adult fiction is a sort of an amorous encounter between reader and fictional character. There's another novel I wanted to mention to you that is called Between the Lines. It's a young adult romantic novel by Jodi Picoult that she co-wrote with her daughter Samantha Lear, and it tells the love story of a teenage bookworm. We can move to the next slide. And then a character from the story, a prince who is dissatisfied with his literary existence and who literally speaks to the readers from the pages of her favorite fairy tale and asks the help of the reader to free him from the confines of the text. Can we move to the next slide so you can have a look at, thank you, the Picoult novel. Another strategy is queering the narrative that will provoke wonder. It's Emma Donoghue's Kissing the Witch, which is again a rewriting of the fairy tale genre for young adult readers. And this is a sort of a challenging of the heteronormative desire. And this will again be tremendously interactive, daring readers to voice their own desires and to decide about the witch's final declaration of gift of choice. What will you do with the stories? You can chew on them, swallow them, spit them out, or pass them along with stories and kisses. So there is again this interconnectivity. You can pass on the stories, and then the story will not end when you close the book, but you can decide to tell it on to another person and then to use it to create interpersonal connections. So it's again a kind of a celebration of the politics of poetics, and also this metafictional enchantment that the readers are pretty much invited to speculate about how the story is being called to life and how we somehow construct our own lives as stories in a way. The metafictional enchantment has ontological consequences due to the narratological device of metalepsis that blurs the boundaries between the story world and our reality. So there is a suggestion that the fictional character and the reader and you can get in touch with each other and both as actors, they are both tellers and the told. So the storyteller and the listener are not that much separated in them anymore. They belong to the same narrative in general sense of the term. Can we move on to the next slide? We have the meta-imaginative pleasure of communally reinventing the shared narratives in Catherine Valente's employment of the social media platforms, where she reclaims the interactive potential of fairy tales, as she is launching her book, The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Making, that eventually transforms into a trilogy. It's about a girl named September who is spirited away from her average life to fairyland, and this was a crowd-funded project that was published serialized online, and each new episode was created based on the suggestions of readers. So it was a kind of an act of co-authorship. So you have a new generation of reader fans who become involved in the development of the story through this cyber community tale-telling association. So this is something that reminds us of the 17th century origins of fairy tales, where you have salon de fées, where you have storytellers sharing stories and inventing stories together. It's mostly female communities of fantasies. So again, you have this gender aspect. So you have the blurring of boundaries between our world and fairyland that again evokes these metafictional dilemmas related to the question of the battle over the narrative. Can we humans who have become caricatures of humans in today's society of spectacle, in which commercials, advertisements, and other media influences invade our lives and determine the plot and narrative of our lives? This is what Jack Sipes, a major scholar of fairy tale, asks from us. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the post-millennial children's fiction repurposes fairy tale tropes to enable young readers to cope with uncertainties and to make sense of incomprehensible new monsters. Which are these new monsters of our age? You have advanced information technology, a very rapid flow of information, which is practically nearly undigestible. You have global consumerism, you have financial crisis, you have socioeconomic inequality, you have environmental catastrophe, you have fractured family structures, migration, permanent threats of terrorism. Now we could act pandemia. So this is all part of our everyday reality, these monsters which are here with us. And basically children's literature, young adult literature helps us, not only children, but even adults, to deal with these monsters through allowing us to face fictionalized alternatives of these real life terrors. The key feature of young adult fiction is its currency. It's always very, very synchronous with the concerns of the audience to whom it's marketed. So it's very, very timely. It's very, very contemporaneous. But you also have the very core patterns of fairy tales returning, these very archaic patterns of folk and fairy tales. You have rites of passages, you have psychological journeys of self-discovery, you have trauma, you have a quest for a remedy, you have a fight of good and evil, and so on. This is interesting because these fairy tale patterns overlap with the most common themes of young adult fiction. The young adult problem novels, as we call them, they are also centered on problems of growing up, on stories of pains and healing and survival, existential struggle related to all sorts of frustrations. They don't necessarily have to be big pains and traumas, but it can be anxiety over grades at school, school bullying, body image, peer pressure, conflicts with parents, and so on. But it's really problem novel, how you could identify many young adult narratives. The examples that I brought in for you here on this slide, you have Meg Fox Transmedia Fairy Tale Collage, which treat repressed memories of child abuse. Then you have Jane Yolen's Briar Rose, and then Louise Murphy's book, The True Story of Hansel and Gretel, which recycle classic fairy tales as allegories of the Holocaust of the concentration camps and the persecution of Jewish people, among others, through the Second World War, their wartime experiences are tackled, so real life historical traumas in a fictional fairy tale format. So basically, you have whatever is the traumatic, unimaginable, or difficult collective historical burden fantastificated in order to be able to deal with it in a more digestible form. Fairy tales, according to Jack Zipes, portray the general human condition of being cast in a world we cannot fully understand nor view as a whole, but there is this ritual healing power of storytelling which will help us transcend the pain of meaninglessness by the power of metamorphosis and the compassionate embracing of otherness, a reinterpretation of our vulnerability, if you like. So this leitmotif of adolescent struggle for the acceptance of difference resonates very well with the twisted versions of classic fairy tales, which rewrites the canonized well-known text. Can we move on to the next slide, please? You can call that a young adult textual revenge that takes many forms through anti-tales. So it's a very interesting recycling of the fairy tale format, because you don't necessarily have a happy ending, but you can recognize the fairy tale structure very often in these young adult novels. Normalized magic, the deep structural patterns, and so on. So you have a familiar set of codes which make the story recognizable. The victimized can fight back aggressively, as in the teen horror movie Hansel and Gretel, Witch Hunters. You have that on the slide. Or you have a first-person shooter computer game, again, transmediation, different media forms, in American Maggie's Alice, where the heroine flees the madhouse to fight the Red Queen. Then you have magic emerging as transformative site for the politics of gender and sexuality, when characters can freely explore their desires, as in Janet Winter's 12 Dancing Princesses, for example. You have the challenging of normative beauty ideals, as in the movie Penelope, which also stages adolescent anxieties over the looks in a lookish society. There's another young adult a book, Melissa Meyer's Cinder, which is a rewriting of Cinderella, but it has a dystopian new Beijing that connects the glass slipper motif to the foot binding tradition of ancient China, from where the earliest version of Cinderella originate. Yet the tiny feet here are not eroticized fetish, but prosthetic implants of a post-human disabled heroine who ends up embracing her animalious embodiment. She's a deformed cyborg with a missing foot, a lunar with a stolen identity, and a mechanic with no one to run to, as she says in the text. So basically, she rewrites her own destiny. Then you have another very interesting take on the wolf character in The Darkest Desire, the wolf's own tale. The character familiar from Red Riding Hood, but this is through his perspective that the story is told. So it's another common strategy of postmodern fairy tale rewritings, that you have a negative character's point of view as another perspective through which you get to know the familiar story in a different way. And this is a strategy that Wicked of Gregory Maguire uses. The life and times of the Wicked Witch of the West suggest that, again, this is the evil character's perspective that will provide us a filter to reiterate the familiar story. This was also turned into a very, very successful Broadway musical hit, and also an interesting text. And this is perhaps my final thought here, that actual cultural traumas which otherwise provoke a collective moral panic, like Hitler and the Holocaust, the First Gulf War, a horrifying murder of a toddler, James Burglar, by local teenagers. These are traumas which are somehow hidden beneath the text. It seems to be a fairy tale rewriting, but there are much more serious social cultural problems somehow thematized in it. And also the issue of being and becoming monstrous. You have the green-skinned witch who resembles Margaret Hamilton from the 1939 film adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, but then she eventually is revealed to be a brave fighter against a totalitarian regime and the defender of animal rights. So you have the dysfunctional family and disability also thematized here. So I think I will stop here in order to leave some time for question time, but you have what I tried to show you, and maybe we can go to the very last slide with Harry Potter on that. Harry Potter could have been another very interesting example for transmedia storytelling. You have the books, you have a film adaptation, you have computer games, but you also have the website Pottermore, where fans can interact with the fantasy world created by J.K. Rowling, and you have a number of very interesting reiteration of a familiar fantasy world, which the point here in today's children's literature is really kind of raising self-conscious readers and using the poetics of the genre for political purposes, teaching empathy, solidarity, and a sort of a responsibility, agency through allowing for interactivity in these texts. Then thank you very much for your attention. I think I will stop here so that we can have some question time.
Okay, thank you so much for giving us such a good and interesting issues related to the topic, Dr. Anna Kerchy. And we are really sorry about the technical error for today. And I just got a new concept, a uncanny. I just know uncanny from the Sigmund Freud, concept, the psychology concept that he delivered in his book. But the concept of uncanny is, yeah, it's just something new for me. Okay, now we come to question and answer session. If you have any question for Dr. Anna Kerchy or related to the topic, you may raise your hand and turn on your microphone. But we just had one question from Mr. Tri Ari Wibowo. Okay, I just read the question out loud. With so many children's literature being converted into different versions, does it indicate that children's literature can be analyzed using comparative literature? If it can be compared, then what aspects are most interesting to analyze?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good, very pertinent questions. So definitely comparative literature, I think, comes to very, very much to the foreground. And it's not only because of languages, but we could also talk about that. How is that this Anglo-centric approach is, I think, gradually being challenged. So if you take a look at big anthologies of children's literature and children's literary criticism, I think that, for example, there is this very, very conscious strategy not to focus only on like English text, British text, or the English language, this Anglo-centricism, American centrism, but you have a variety of different perspectives from many parts of the world. So that would be like one aspect, even like if you take a classic fairy tale and then you take a look at the many versions which are existing all over the globe. So I think that one of the most recent critical collections of children's literature was called like children's literature from a global perspective. So definitely this comparative approach, so trying to move beyond the Anglocentrism, because many like sociological surveys suggest that in the children's book markets, very often you would have like English, British, American authors translated into different languages, which are the most hot bestsellers. So there's high time to move beyond this kind of Anglocentrism. And the other thing, the comparative approach, the comparison of different media. So basically transmedia storytelling is all about adaptation. It's not simply adaptation into different media formats that you could compare. So you have a book and then you have a film adaptation and then you have a theater stage adaptation and a computer game adaptations and so on. But it's also how they interact one another. And after a while, you move away from the original text. Okay, so there is no longer hierarchy that you have to be familiar with the book itself in order to be familiar with the fantasy universe, but but there are a whole lot of children and youngsters who are thoroughly familiar with the Harry Potter world. For example, they choose their own houses. They are very much enjoying this fantasy realm in an interactive manner, but they haven't read the book. They have seen the movies, they have seen various different visual adaptations. So I think that's a new phenomena that's interesting from this comparative studies perspective, comparative literature's perspective, that literature's interaction with different media and perhaps different media overtaking the primary importance or positionality of literature, and they're existing in interaction with one another. So definitely I would agree that it's a very, very important perspective, comparative literature.
Okay, thank you. It's so interesting because children literature get less attention nowadays, but now so many scholars just focus on children literature, especially in Indonesia, because it's a little bit hard to find the children literary works. And is there any question? Oh, yeah, we have another question from Miss Vera Yulia. It's a very interesting topic, Prof. Excuse me, Prof. The question, how to create meta-imaginative pleasure, especially for mixing code case. Is there an attention to different grades when we want to apply them? Thank you, Prof. From Vera Yulia.
So definitely, I would say that there is also an insistence on the pedagogical factors here. Like just next week, there will be the Congress of the International Research Society for the Study of Children's Literature. It will take place online, just like this conference, and this is organized by the University of Chile. And their focus is pedagogical entanglements. And basically, I think, again, if we want to talk about like comparative studies, that's another major point, that trying to move beyond pure theoretization. So the point of children's literature should not be that adults are talking about children's literature with adults, but somehow having actual interaction with children. And this raising the meta-imaginative consciousness, awareness, or experience can take place in a variety of different ways. And I think there are pedagogical programs which help teachers, educators to adopt these strategies. Like many of these texts, children's stories, young adult stories, are structured in a way. I'm quite sure that you have seen many of these editions, that you have the book, the novel, and at the end of it, you already have a list of questions, like how you can deal with the text, how you can involve actually the students to be reflecting on their own imaginative agency. So how do we call these fantasy words into being, and to realize this fact that through feeling for the fictional characters, we somehow are exercising empathy. We learn how to feel for other human beings. We learn tolerance, empathy, solidarity, and for different age groups, again, related to globalization and to this kind of an intercultural dynamics. I think that today, for example, the paper theaters, which are originally, I think it's something that is popular in Asia, is just making a very popular progress in Europe and America and the UK, that would be a kind of an interactive way of creating a meta-imaginative pleasure. That you have a paper theater is when you have just the illustrations from a picture book, and then you are telling the story like orally in an oral verbal presentation to children, and then sort of putting up the images and then initiating a discussion, a conversation about them. And it's not just telling the story and it's closed and it's finished, but then afterwards there is a conversation. And I think this is the creativity afford for children, that they have an ability to ask questions, to interact, even to write their own stories. And this is, I think, would be something very, very typical, regardless of age groups, that the children, the youngsters will be urged to write their own stories, to continue their stories, and to write their own versions. So instead of just addressing readers as passive consumers, as listeners, I think they are encouraged And it's of course depending on the different ages how this encouragement takes place, but they are encouraged to become co-authors, authors, active creators themselves. And if you think of the many blogs and vlogs and videos made by youngsters in response to their reading experiences, this is another proof of that, how social media platform becomes a terrain where youngsters have conversations about film experiences, book experiences they have. So this pedagogical aspect is definitely important.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Dr. Anna Kerchy. Excuse me, Dr. Anna Kerchy, is it possible that we open the last question?
Yes. We cannot hear you, Andre.
Okay, sorry. Okay, you have one chance to ask a question. So this is the last question. If you have any question related to the topic or have something in your mind to ask to Dr. Anna Kerchy, feel free to ask. You can raise your hand or and turn on your microphone if you ask directly, or you can use the control panel from your chat feature and you read, and I will ask your question to Dr. Anna Kerchy. Is there any question? Okay, Mr. Bob. Okay, finish your Mr. Bob.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Andri. Actually, dear Dr. Kerchy, my question is, I have a toddler and I want to make him to get closer to the literature since he in his childhood. So my question is right now, what are the best strategies to get closer my boy to the children literature, actually, especially to fairy tales? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting question. I think it's a kind of a responsibility that all of us we have as parents, as educators, to raise readers, because basically anything that they will read will help us to submerge into a fictional universe, and again to learn about these basic human values of empathy and solidarity that I keep emphasizing. With the fairy tales, I think it's very interesting because you probably know that in the US there are all these scandals continuously about, for example, the Brother Grimm's fairy tales being inadequate for children because they are too frightening. But I don't agree with that. So I think that you will have wonderful like picture book adaptations. Any picture book adaptation would do, because they are structured in a way that they will really teach even the youngest strategies of survival, ways of dealing and coping with the words. I totally agree with the Neil Gaiman quotation that I gave you, that fairy tales are really not about trying to suggest to children that dragons exist and frightening them, but suggesting that dragons can be beaten. So I would say that for the youngest, you have stories like the Three Little Pigs, where you have the pigs fighting the wolf and triumphing. It's always the weak and the poor and the ones that the kids can identify with, the small who triumphs in the stories. So it also gives them self-consciousness. I mean, kind of awareness of the powers that they might own, even if they are small and little. So I think that animal stories are a wonderful way of initiating children's to fairy tale cultures, because animals are usually things that, or creatures, living beings that kids are fond of, right? But you also have kind of human conflicts, and you have this very optimistic message of hope that the good wins over the evil. So I would start with animal stories.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your generous explanation, complete, Dr. Kerchy. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you to Dr. Anna Kerchy. Thank you for all the participants. I think Dr. Anna Kerchy still have something to show us about the Harry Potter. Dr. Anna Kerchy,
I think that we didn't really have time for
Okay,
that, so it's not a
okay.
problem.
Let's do
If
that.
anyone is interested, I'm really happily at your disposal, so you can write me an email. You have my contact, and I'm happy to discuss these issues further. But I think that we managed to touch upon the most important points. So thank you.
Okay. Okay, so finally we come to the end of this session. Before closing this session, I want to draw some conclusion here. So we got so many information about analytical approach to fairy tale cultures and media that we can use to explore children literature and young adult literature. And Dr. Anna Kerchy has opened her house of knowledge, and hopefully we can become a good thieves so we can steal the knowledge and information from her. Okay, I think that's enough. Thank you for all the participants. Thank you for very active participation. My name is Andri Fernanda. Have a good day all, and I give it back to Master of Ceremony. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Andi Fernanda and Associate Professor Dr. Habil Anakarsi for a really great discussion. Before we continue to the next agenda, we would like to capture our screen as the documentation of this conference. So to all the honorable speakers, moderator, ladies and gentlemen, please turn on your camera. We will have a photo session. Okay, are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more time. 1, 2, 3. Okay, last time. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much. Before we go to the break time, I would like to inform you that we have a parallel room, and this parallel room will be delivered by the moderator. The parallel session 3 is for the sociology and culture with Mr. Michael Jeffrey as the moderator. And for all the oral speaker participants, you can join the parallel room in accordance with your topic, and we will go back to this room at 16:15 or for past quarter for closing agenda, which will be delivered by Mr. Bob Morrison for closing remarks. So for everybody and for all the oral speakers, you are allowed to enter the parallel sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anna Kerchy.
I hope we can meet in person, Dr. Anna Kerchy.
Me too.